The honourable member for Newton North Delta.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure tonight to rise and talk in support of Bill S-12, an act to amend the Statutory Instrument Act and to make consequential amendments to the Statutory Instruments Regulations. And we're supporting this bill at this stage for it to go to committee so that it can be clarified and big questions that are being asked can be answered. I often think, Mr. Speaker, that in this Ottawa bubble sometimes we use language and terms and we put stuff out there thinking that the public out there is really going to be able to understand what is it that is being debated in the House of Commons tonight. What is it that the MPs from across this country are here at 8:45 going to carry on discussing until midnight? And, you know, being an English teacher, I always want to see something in the title, something that will give me a clue, some kind of a lead. But when I read this, and if I was not sitting here, if I was sitting outside in my living room, I really would be wondering what on earth members of Parliament are discussing tonight. And that, to me, is a huge, huge issue. We talk about participatory democracy. We televise the glorious debates that go on in this most august house. And we know that there are people across this country, might only be my mother and your grandmother and somebody else's daughter, who are sitting at home glued to the TV set watching this. But you know, Mr. Speaker, there are Canadians who do care and do watch CPAC.
That's true.
And they watch because they really are engaged in the subjects we're discussing. And I think we do them a disservice at times
Responsible citizens.
by the language we use and the language we present.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I really worry about that at times, but I'm sure we will talk about that at length. But as previous speakers have said, we're really talking about changes to either static or ambulatory. Aren't those wonderful words? You could write poetry with those, right? Regulations that are buried into legislation that can be changed as a result of other laws or regulations being changed without it ever coming to this House. And that should give us a little bit of concern, and I hope it does. But here are some facts and figures around this that were quite shocking, even to me, after I've been here for 2 years. They are at the federal level alone, and by the way, this is a quote from the Department of Justice Canada, Federal Regulations Manual, 1998, page 3. In case any of you need any bedtime reading, I'm sure it'll be great. And this is what it quotes in there. They are, at the federal level alone, approximately 3,000 regulations comprising over 30,000 pages, compared with some 450 statutes comprising about 13,000 pages. Furthermore, departments and agencies submit to the regulation section on average about 1,000 draft regulations each year, whereas Parliament enacts about 80 bills during the same period. The executive thus plays a major role in setting rules of law that apply to Canadian citizens. And therein lies the rub. And you know, as much as we're sending this on to that next stage, to committee stage, when the stark numbers here hit, you know, really strike home, that whereas Parliament deals with 80 bills in a year, though with going till midnight, this might be the new norm going into the fall as well, we might be able to do more, especially with all the time allotments and moving closure motions and everything. When I look at all of that and look at that 1,000 regulatory changes are made or draft regulations are presented, you really begin to worry about the state of our democracy. You really begin to worry about the state of our democracy. Because what happens when changes are made by regulation, it invests so much power in the hands of the executive, in the hands of ministers, and what it does is those regulatory changes actually sidestep parliamentary oversight, parliamentary debate. Debate here, going to committee, being fine-tuned, coming back here and debated again. And that really, as parliamentarians, should give us a pause to stop and think about what our role is as parliamentarians. There are, by the way, Mr. Speaker, some things that do make sense to be in regulations. For example, you wouldn't want to spend weeks and months and years in here discussing what the interest rate should be at the Bank of Canada, right? That's sort of like an ambulatory regulatory change. You wouldn't want to, and quite honestly, I really wouldn't want to spend months and years discussing that. But on the other hand, there are regulatory changes that get made that I would want to discuss in this House, because they could affect how Canadians live, how they work, how they retire, and how they spend their leisure time. So we can't think that this is just a technical document, that this bill is just a cleaning up, housekeeping. It's purely technical, because when you think of how it's going to be applied in the future, and when you think about how many regulations are introduced each year and then get changed, sometimes at ministerial whim, then we really have to worry. Because, as the previous speaker said, you know, there were lots of questions he was being answered and he asked, and he said, I just don't know the answer. Because reading the legislation, those things are not very clear at all. And, you know, Mr. Speaker, as I was going through this, you know, through the legislation, because, you know, it really kind of makes you stop and think that sometimes what we consider as just a technical change, a little bit of housekeeping, actually ends up impacting people's daily lives. I can remember from another life, when I was a teacher, when another government, a provincial government, decided that what they were going to do was do some housekeeping, get rid of a lot of the red tape around the identification and designation of students with special needs. And you know what happened with that, Mr. Speaker? Overnight, after the regulatory changes were made and the red tape was got rid of, what happened is children who had very specific and legitimate and diagnosed learning needs on a Friday, by the following Monday, they no longer had those needs. And it gave the government reason not to fund those. So even though at the time in British Columbia, we welcomed, many people welcomed, let's get rid of the red tape, let's get rid of a lot of the stuff that surrounds this. And people did not realize that removing a word here or a phrase there was going to lead to having such an impact on families and students, families of students with special needs. So we have to be very, very careful, and I know we're talking about international and national agreements and all of these regulations that change in other places, but you know, Mr. Speaker, one of these days, what if there is a government that makes some changes and that automatically forces changes embedded changes right here that impact us and our everyday lives? I think we would be very, very concerned. The other thing we're very concerned about, Mr. Speaker, of course, is that we're a bilingual nation. It's embedded in our Constitution. And yet, we know that a lot of these regulations are not available to the public in a bilingual manner. So we want to make sure that they are there. Mr. Speaker, let me step back a moment. I misspoke. What I'm looking for in this document is a guarantee, explicit guarantee, that these regulations, embedded, static, ambulatory, I don't really care what the name is, that when they are embedded, that they are there in both the official languages. That's what I'm looking for. And we want to make sure that we have that. And we also want to make sure that we want to take a look at this document and we want to look at strengthening it in ways so we can make sure that there isn't that kind of abuse. And you know, it's always good when we look at accountability and specificity, when things are really specific. And what we want to do is also make sure, you know, we live in this age today, electronic age it's been called, age of technology. I'm not as familiar with the full range of technology, but I do know that today my children, grandchildren, and the young people I know, as young at heart too, many who are retired, spend much time on the computer, and they want that kind of access. They want to be able to access the regulations and to be able to read them and to be able to understand them, and they want the history.
Absolutely.
Whereas at the age of 19, I was quite happy to know none of what was in the back room. I find that when my children or grandchildren do research now, and it's an amazing thing to watch my grandchildren, the twins who are in grade 8, they actually go way, way deeper because everything is available to them in their computer. And they ask the kind of questions I wouldn't have asked at their age. So I think we've got to make sure that we make available to the public not just this is the change that has been made, but they have to know what it was before and what the impact of that change is going to be. And once again, I do have some reservations, is that none of that is going to be discussed anywhere, and that should be concerning for all of us. And, you know, when I also take a look at this document, which, you know, I sort of hear a lot about accountability, transparency. Absolutely, we need all of those things. And then I think of where this came from, a place not so popular these days, not for many anyway. And I know that while there it has gone through some scrutiny and some changes have been made. But we're supporting this so that it can go to a parliamentary committee where it can receive microscopic scrutiny, and where we're also hoping that our colleagues across the aisle will not behave or be as they have been at other committees where I have been, where we have taken amendments that ministers have even suggested and we thought we had agreement on, and suddenly they are not there. So we're hoping that when we go to committee and our official opposition amendments come to that committee, that they will be considered on their merit and not just rejected because they come from the official opposition. And you know what? I have a couple of my colleagues who look aghast as if that never happens. And let me assure them that I have sat at a committee where I have seen that happen over and over and over again.
Me too.
Even where we've had committee members say, you know, that was a good amendment. Or even where we've had a minister walk in and say, you know what, I know you have some concerns about this. I'd be quite happy to put this line in. And we take the criteria he suggested, word for word, and we put it in. And suddenly, guess what? Opposed. You know, it leaves you second guessing, like what is the real agenda here? So we do worry about that as well. And the other thing is, you know, when we talk about accountability and the ability to work together, I don't think that there are quite a few things that I could really bring up. And, Mr. Speaker, I have a great deal of concern around regulations. I was absolutely shocked as a Member of Parliament at how much substantive change can be made to the laws of this land through changes to regulations. For example, when I look at the area of immigration, where we have seen a huge transformation, huge transformation that has impacted people, a lot of that work, a lot of those changes never went to be debated at a committee of Parliament, nor did they come to this august body, the House of Commons, to be debated. What happened was they appeared on a website through a press conference, and oh, these are changes a minister can make. So at the same time as I'm supporting this, I'm also expressing a very deeply held concern over the subversion of democracy as more and more power is vested into the hands of ministers and the executive branch. And I am not trying to take any shots at my colleagues in government, because I believe a lot of this was started by a party that sits in that corner right now, especially when I look at the area of immigration. I mean, just take a look at what happened the Friday before we went back to our ridings for Home Week. Just look, Friday afternoon, we get massive changes to family reunification. I'm a vice chair of the Immigration Committee, not there. I come to Parliament on a regular basis, not discussed here, but announced. And the announcements are absolutely floundering. And I have talked with communities that are just saying they are just reeling from the changes, and they are so fundamental that they put into question our commitment towards community building and our commitments towards families. And yet, Mr. Speaker, all of those things happened. Those changes without any debate in the House. 30% increase to the income requirements. 30% before somebody can sponsor their parent to come and move to Canada. And yet many people in this House and across this country have enjoyed the benefits of family reunification over the years. And we all talk about the value of family. Then you take a look at this. When 1 in 5 Canadians is born overseas, is born outside of Canada, we have actually introduced a lottery system for family reunification. Because what we've told Canadians right across this great country, no matter where you come from, only 5,000 applications are going to be taken each year. And you know what? I never looked at it until I was talking with a group in my riding, and somebody said, that's like the lottery. So I could have to wait years and years and years and years even to get in line to come into the country. By the way, when you apply, that's not a guarantee. That's when you can join the line. So what have we done there? I could go on, Mr. Speaker, at length about other things that happen in this parliamentary democracy that actually shut down debate. We've seen it happen. Closures, time allocations. And so then I hear rhetoric of this is all about accountability, this is just about cleaning up things. Forgive me if I don't sort of think, oh, suddenly we've moved to a new phase of parliamentary debate in this House. So, as I said, Mr. Speaker, we will be supporting this going into the committee stage. And we're certainly hoping that the public, when they read the regulations, will have the kind of transparency and also the kind of language that will be comprehensible by the average person. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Okanagan, Cook